Hello and welcome to this first in the Blender Basics series of videos. So as somebody who's grown up using 3ds Max, for me Blender has just been a brand new toy to play with and is super friendly to use for those who just want to start off doing 3D modeling. It's free to download on PC and Mac, also on Linux. And the interface in the last year or two has actually got to a point where it's actually user friendly. There are plenty of tutorials out there and people covering this, so I won't be going too far down the rabbit hole, and I'll definitely encourage you, if you are encouraged to want to use Blender for AR, VR or any other visual effects pipelines, to follow those channels and try and invest in some of those courses where possible. I'm basically going to be just doing a more overview and making a few objects in Blender, and I'll be kind of trying things out as I go along with you. So in this video, we're just going to go through the Blender interface. So I'm using the latest version of Blender on a Mac. And when I start talking about keyboard shortcuts, please bear in mind that the keyboard shortcuts on a Mac may be slightly different than they are on Windows. But you should just be able to translate the commands to controls, etc. Accordingly. Okay, so let's begin. So I've just started up a new project, and by default it's given us this primitive cube object. This here is our scene view, so everything that's within here is going to be what's in our final piece. So by default, when we've started a new scene, it's added this primitive at the point of 0, 0. So if we look here, we have this grid. Each of these squares is 1 by 1 meter. At the moment, again, we can adjust the size if we go to preferences afterwards, but for the purposes of this video, we're not going to worry about that. We have a camera added to the scene. This camera is again going to be our rendered view, how our rendered piece would be shown if it's an animation, because with Blender you can use it for, obviously, for 3D model exports, but you can also do 2D, 3D animation in here, material texturing, sculpting, and so much more. Again, we're only going to be scratching the surface with this series of videos. And we also have a light. Now this light will basically use our sort of surrounding, our environmental light in this case. And this just basically means that we can see what we're doing. If we added more lights in there, we could set directional lights, and that would adjust how things like shadows would be cast when the objects have been done, put on our scene. Again, we're not going to worry too much about lighting because we're going to be review of exporting these into game engines or Spark, for example, where the lighting and the shadow casting would be done by those engines, not necessarily baked in via Blender for that iteration. Okay, so I'm just going to go through the controls very quickly. So over here, we're in object mode. So we have our select box. So obviously that means whatever we left click on, or when we click and drag our left button, whatever we draw over is selected. That's kind of self-explanatory. We have our move tool, which we can also access via G. So with G selected, I can move my mouse around and my cube would move around with it. Now these next three tools that we go through, bear in mind there is a smarter way of working with these, but for now I'm just going to go through them. We've got our R, or rotation, so I could press R on my keyboard and move my mouse, and this will allow me to rotate it freely, depending on the viewport I'm in at that point in time. We have S for scale, so again, self-explanatory. And then when we want to confirm it, we just left click to confirm. I'm just going to press Command Z to undo, or Control Z if you're on Windows. However, if we were using these tools and we only want to control them on one value, there is a simple way of doing that. And the simple way is we would use the keyboard shortcut, for example, G for move. And if I only wanted to move it on the X-axis, for example, I'd press G, then X. And now I can only move it on the X, and I can't move it anywhere diagonally or on the Y or up or down. It's literally stuck to that one axis. Likewise, I could do the same with the rotate tool. So I could go R, X, and now I can only rotate it on the X axis. If I wanted to rotate it a very particular amount of degrees, I could type in the number, so 45, and then hit confirm or enter. And it will now rotate my cube 45 degrees. And then lastly, this can also be do with scale, so I can press S, then X, and now I can only scale on the X-axis. So you can kind of see how keyboard shortcuts and getting familiar with them will make your workflow a lot more intuitive. So at the moment we're in our default shaded view. So this has a material applied, but we can't currently see it because we're in a kind of grey work mode view at the moment. We can also toggle to wireframe. So if we had highly detailed or complex polygonal models and we wanted to work out where things intersect or how many polygons are going to be in our final model, because again, if we're using Blender for AR or VR, we want to try and keep our polygon count as low as possible. So trying to keep our vertices, edges, etc. to a reasonable level will just make our lives a lot easier for mobile deployment. Not so much an issue if you're going to be deploying this on a super high resolution GTX or RTX PC that can run everything, you know what I mean? This is more to keep in mind if you're running this on more consumer grade hardware and software at the end for implementations. We also have a material view, so this is the material that's currently applied, and again we'll look at that in a future video, but for now we're just going to keep it at the default view. If I press tab, this will change me to edit mode. I can also change my mode by clicking this little button up here and changing between object and edit mode. We're not going to worry about sculpt mode yet, we'll look at that in a future video, but sculpt mode again is self-explanatory. This is kind of like working with clay to 3D model with, so you can start off with a sphere or cube and then cut into it and start to build up more complex geometry. However, when you start doing that, you will start to find that you are building more a higher density polygonal model. So again, we'll look at how we can simplify that in the future when we get to that stage. So with edit mode, we have a few new options. So again, we got the move tools, the scale, rotations. We also have a few more. So we have the option to extrude. So for example, if I just choose to select a face, so up here we've got vertex selection, edge and face. If I select a face and hit E and then move my mouse, this allows me to extrude. So I can extrude on edges to start building up more complex shapes. So any face I could do that with. We also have this one here, which is inset. So if I press I, sometimes this one's a little bit glitchy on my machine, so you just have to somewhat bear with whilst I get my computer to play ball. Okay, I'm just going to use the tool itself. There we go. So I'm just going to select this face. There we go. So as you see, it's a little bit sensitive, my mouse is at the moment. So when we press I can add an intercept. So I can add a kind of more polygon count, so I can start to build boundaries. So again, I could do that again, and do that as many times as I want. And then each of these here, I could start to move and shape as I want. So I could even recreate my own channel logo using this method. Just duplicating this cube and boxes and boxes. And then just keeping these flattened by making sure that the rotations on these are flat. But I'm not going to worry about that for now. So just an example again to show that the extrude works. If I select one of these and press E, I can extrude. And I can do this on each of the faces and start to build up quite complex geometry fairly easily. And again, we'll be looking at that more when we start building some of our projects. Next tool we have is our bevel tool. Which we can get to by pressing Control and B. And when we've got a face selected or edge selected and we move our mouse, we can start to create this taper around the corners. So because I selected a face, it's tapering all my edges. However, I could also do this on one particular corner or one edge. So if I select this one edge here, then I press bevel again, I can start to slice into my shape. If I wanted to select more than one point at a time, I could select one edge, hold shift, hold, and then select another edge, and then do the same again. And you can kind of see how this principle could be used for building up a kind of curved edge. But again, when we're doing it that way, we are adding more data to our model, which would increase the file size and rendering power that's required. We can also cut our mesh, but again, we'll look at that more in future videos, alongside smoothing and such. I'm not going to worry about any of that for now. Okay, so here we have our basic shape. We can start playing about with it. But what if we wanted to, for example, cut a hole in this or cut another shape into it? How would we do that in a simple way? So we could, to do that, we need to go back to object mode. So whenever we're going to add more models into our scene, we need to make sure we're in object mode to do this. We can then go to add, and this is where we could add in 2D images for references that you can use. So if you used to do a 3D model of a person or an animal, you'd have a front or reference image, a left and right reference image, and a top reference image, for example, and then start to build geometry from that. You can also add armature. So if you've got a 3D model of a person, you can start to build the armature to create the ligaments for animation, cameras, lights, etc. But we're just going to add a cylinder mesh for now. And if I move this cylinder mesh so it intercepts my model, so I'm just going to move it so it intercepts this edge here, I can now start to think about how I could play about cutting this out. So the easiest way I find to cut out one model from another is we select the model that we want to be the final piece, so the piece that's going to have a slice cut out of it from. So in this case, my cube. So I select my cube, I go to the modify properties, which is this little spanner icon over here. I can go to add modifier, add a boolean, and then where it says object, I'd select my model I want to be used as the cutout. So I'm making sure that my cylinder is intercepting my model. I select cylinder. I want to keep the operation set to difference, and again we'll look at the differences of those in future videos, but for now we're just going to set to difference. I hit apply, and now if I move my cylinder out of the way, set my cylinder out of the way and hit apply, this should cut it out like so, which it has. Now it's not a perfect cut, we have this erroneous edge here because I hadn't quite lined it up correctly before I did the cut. But you can see we can start to use this principle to cut out shapes from each other. And then each of these, when I go back into edit mode, would still count as individual elements that I could modify and drag, etc. So that's a very simple way of doing a cut. Again, we'll look at the proper way of doing this in future videos. For now, this is just more of an introductory option. Whenever we're finished our piece or our animation, we can always go to render the image, and this would give you the view that's coming through the default camera. And this is what quite often is used for the kind of high-res renders that you would expect to see for mock-ups, for example. Okay, so this has just been a very brief, quick overview. I'm not even showing you 90% of what Blender can do. It is just a kind of introductory to the software and a kind of encouragement for you to download it and start messing about, moving vertices around, playing with the tools, trying out the keyboard shortcuts, get the keyboard shortcuts memorized. There is a couple of fantastic applications that you can get for iOS and Android devices that basically act as Blender shortcut tools, and they're good. It's always good to reference things like that. You can, just as a kind of quick side note, if I just go to object mode and select cylinder, you can do obviously animation with this. So for example, if I was to select cylinder, and down here we've got a timeline. Let me just expand this. So for those who are interested in animation with Blender, Again, we'll cover this in more detail in a dedicated video, but just as a very quick kind of introductory step, we would always use this animation window. We would press the auto keying to start recording. And this is our timeline. So at 0, I want this to stay here, but at 60 frames, I want this to be up here. At 120, I want this to start to rotate. And then back here, I want this to, at this point here, I want this to return to this frame here and copy the values back to there. So if I was to play this now, this would work very similar to After Effects or any other animation program where we've got these keyframes and we can start to create animations like so. And again, we'll look at that in more detail in a dedicated video. So this is the start of the Blender Basics series, a short little addition, and we'll be utilising this for our VR and AR tutorials in the future. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again soon.